Hey, physiology students. All right, this is going to be lecture chapter 4, part 1. This is the lecture for Friday. This is the introduction to neurons, a quick review from anatomy, but most importantly, we're going to be talking about neurotransmitters and how signals are passed from one cell to another. And believe it or not, this chapter, other than chapter 1, it's probably the most important chapter for nursing, for the nursing program for pharmacology. So I want you to pay special attention and work really hard trying to master this material, because believe it or not, you're going to see this material again in semester 1 of pharmacology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you some of the emails I got from students that are in the nursing program after taking my class. And they emailed me back out of the blue and said, "Hey, Dr. Barbeau, I'm so glad you really pushed us to know acetylcholine and cholinergic receptors and epinephrine and adrenergic receptors and how that controls your peripheral nervous system. Because boy, in pharmacology, I was studying and I didn't have to learn all this material fresh. They want you to know this in nursing." So here's a couple of emails, all right? I blocked out the names, but this was sent, let's see, just this month, okay? So I was in your class and now I'm in nursing school. I just had my first day of pharmacology, and she told us if we haven't had physiology, we want to review it because she expects you to know this material about receptors, blockers, which is agonists and antagonists, already. So that's what we're going to be covering in this chapter. So that's one student, and I've got so many, but here's another one saying, "Thank you so much for teaching us the somatic nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, that beta, alpha, adrenergic receptors and nicotinic receptors and so on and so forth. It prepared nursing students with a good foundation because in pharmacology, they need it." Okay? All right, so that was, I think, over the summer. Okay, here's another email. Okay, this student said, "Thank you. I wanted to share with you what we're studying now. The core of the next 2 or 3 weeks of pharmacology revolve around the peripheral nervous system. So it's important to understand this." And so he sent a picture of his notes. And so let's look what we're seeing. Nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic and somatic motor. And then under autonomic, the parasympathetic and sympathetic effects on the body. So look at that. Now, right now, it looks like gobbledygook to you, but trust me, you are going to want to know this material. Okay, so let's get back, okay? So what we are covering today is part of chapter 4, part 1. All right, so let me move this out of the way. This is what those students were talking about in the email they sent to me. So we're going to just do a basic introduction to neurons and neuron anatomy. And then the most important thing is understand how neurons communicate with one another, or from a neuron to a muscle cell or a gland cell. Okay, so we're all going to get to part of this today. So remember that when we're going through the PowerPoint, when you're going through the PowerPoint, when I give you page numbers to the wiki textbook, all you have to do is type those page numbers in. So here we're talking about neurons, and if you go to page 73 of the wiki textbook, let's do that. You can open up your wiki textbook and type in page 73, and boom, you're right there talking about receptors, nervous tissue, neurons, and so forth, and you can see where I've left you notes. Okay, so let's resume. So we're going to begin with a review from anatomy, I hope you have this, of neurons, interneurons, and glial cells. So under neurons, which is where we're going to be spending our time, is sensory neurons. They're part of the afferent nervous system. These are sensory receptors that pick up information on touch, pain, pressure, vibration, all kinds of stretch, all kinds of information. Okay, and they're going to transmit that information up your spinal cord to your brain. That information is going to be going up the spinal cord. The next type of neurons are motor neurons. Okay, let's see if we can get this to go. Okay, so motor neurons carry commands from your brain, and those are going to go to effectors. They're going to go down your spinal cord, out into your peripheral body, and those commands are going to go to muscle cells or glands. All right, so we'll be spending most of the chapter talking about that. I'm not going to talk much about interneurons, except I'm going to show you a picture of where they're located. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the neuroglial cells, which are helper neural cells that help neurons do their job, but they have very special functions. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so I talked about in another chapter, I believe, how information is going one way or another in the body, whether it's going up to the brain or down the spinal cord out to the body. But when we're talking about neurons, we're going to start here talking about sensory neurons or afferent neurons. Got it here in orange, okay? Notice the direction of the signal. The receptors pick up information, transmit that information to the spinal cord, and then that information goes up to the brain, probably in the parietal lobe where sensory information is interpreted, but it's going up, so it's ascending and it's afferent. Now, motor commands come down from the brain, down the spinal cord. I've got it here in green, and that is going to leave the spinal cord. Sometimes a motor neuron can originate in the spinal cord, and sometimes they can't quite make it there. So this is where we'll have an interneuron that reaches out from the spinal cord to the peripheral nervous system. But let's look at two different types of motor commands that can come out from the brain. So here in green, there's the interneuron. That's probably the last I'm going to mention those. Okay, in yellow here, I've got a somatic motor neuron, and this motor neuron is carrying commands for movement or contraction of muscles. And since it's somatic, that means voluntary, and the muscles you have voluntary control of are your skeletal muscles right there, okay? So somatic, think of voluntary. Now the next type of motor command is one for involuntary muscles or glands. So in white here, I've got autonomic motor neurons, and that goes to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So I want you to think, smooth muscle, you probably learned it in anatomy. Cardiac muscle is easy because cardiac means heart muscle. But where is smooth muscle found in the body? All right, you might have learned, if you studied the vascular system, there's smooth muscle lining your arteries, which allows those muscles to either constrict the arteries, vasoconstriction, or relax and open those arteries up wide. Remember chapter 1, we talked about that? Okay, there's smooth muscle all along your digestive tract, your esophagus, stomach, intestines. There's smooth muscle lining your bronchioles or your airways. And just like arteries, your bronchioles can bronchoconstrict or bronchodilate. And then there's smooth muscle in your reproductive and urinary tracts as well. Okay, so let's move on. Glial cells. So I've color-coded these. The ones that I have in red are going to be found in the peripheral nervous system, and the majority are going to be found in the central nervous system. I put here in blue. But we'll start with ependymal cells. You might have learned this in anatomy. I know you learned the ventricles of the brain. And if you remember, the ventricles of the brain are where cerebral spinal fluid circulates. And that cerebral spinal fluid is made in the choroid plexus associated with each ventricle. Guess what's found in the choroid plexus? Ependymal cells, and they make the ultra pure cerebral spinal fluid that bathes your brain and spinal cord. All right, those are glial cells. The next, astrocytes. We'll talk a little bit about that in chapter 4, part 2. But astrocytes form your blood-brain barrier. Your brain is not bathed directly with your blood because there could be toxins or bacteria or who knows what. So what happens is astrocytes filter the materials that are carried in your arterial blood, like gases and nutrients, and that diffuses across this blood-brain barrier, then gets incorporated to the CSF. All right, so astrocytes. Next, microglia are basically your brain's cleanup crew. These are going to be immune cells that circulate around your brain, and if they encounter pathogens, bacteria, viruses, they're going to engulf them and destroy them. So they're a specific immune cell to your brain. Okay, next, Schwann cells are in the peripheral nervous system. Oligodendrocytes are in the central nervous system, but both these cells do the same thing. They make the myelin sheath that covers the axon of neurons, and that speeds up the transmission of electrical impulses, okay? Now here's how I remember the difference between Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. I remember oligodendrocytes is a longer, complicated word, and your central nervous system is a much more complicated neural network than your peripheral nervous system. That helps me remember between the two, all right? Okay, lastly, satellite cells. We're not going to talk a lot about those, but they are cells that cover the peripheral nervous system neurons that are involved with sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Okay, so that's our brief introduction to glial cells. We'll come back to some of those in future chapters. Okay, quick review of a neuron's anatomy. I have to assume you had this in anatomy, so we're going to go through quickly. So dendrites are the little extensions off the front part of a neuron where it's receiving information from another neuron. And they pick that information up, and it starts an action potential, and then it goes to the cell body of the neuron where the little nucleus is. And then what happens is that impulse is passed along the axon of the neuron. Okay, so it's a long tube, kind of like the body. Okay, now some neurons are going to have a myelin sheath around them, and so that's what's shown here. Just these are actual cells themselves, and what that does is it speeds up the impulse. I've got it here, an unmyelinated axon. The impulse travels at 0.5 meter per second. If it's myelinated, it's 100 meters per second, so it's logarithmically bigger. All right, the nodes of Ranvier. These are actually spaces in between the myelin sheaths, and the signal actually jumps from one node to the next. Okay, so between the nodes and the myelin sheath, I've got a little GIF here showing you on the bottom an unmyelinated neuron, and the blue impulse, the action potential, with the myelinated neuron. Look how fast that goes along, much, much faster. Okay, so where will you find myelinated neurons in the body? You're going to find it in white matter tracks. So if you learn this in anatomy, we have gray matter, we have white matter. And white matter is like your information highway. It's getting information from point A to point B, and you want that signal to be fast. So white matter is white because of the myelin sheaths. Okay, last parts. The synaptic knob is at the end of the neuron, and I've got a blow-up image down here showing them. Now this is where all the magic happens with neurotransmitters. So this is going to be my segue into what is released from one neuron to another neuron, a muscle cell, or a gland. So we're going to look at the next slide, and we're going to kind of blow up that image of the synaptic knob. Okay. So before we go on to that, let's talk about a nursing application of myelin sheaths. So on page 74 of your wiki textbook, and if you click online, which I will in a second here, I've got an extra clinical app reading about multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disorder. What does autoimmune mean? Auto means self, and immune means your immune system. So it's your own immune system attacking yourself. And in this case, they're attacking the myelin sheaths on these neurons, and it slows down the impulse and the signal doesn't get to where it needs to go fast enough. And the immune system keeps attacking, and eventually those neurons become so scarred with scleroses that they're permanently damaged, okay? And so eventually you'll see motor problems in patients and even cognitive problems. So if we go to the online reading here, wait for this to come up. So remember, when you're looking at the PDF of these PowerPoints, these hyperlinks remain active, so you'll be able to click on them. Okay. Okay, here we go. Make it a little bigger for you. Multiple sclerosis, diagnosed most often in women between ages of 20 and 40. It's a chronic disease because your immune system keeps attacking itself. And so you can read about some of the problems that you see with that. Now, we also have in the textbook, which I'm going to pull up the reading 74. Let's pull up that page. Okay, case study, look at that. Man was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, chronic degenerative progressive disorder that affects the brain and spinal cord. So they tell you what myelin is. And basically early symptoms of the disorder may include vision changes, which is blurred vision, spotty vision, things like that. And also muscle weakness. And it progresses, it usually starts out in your extremities and then it works its way into your core. So most patients with this disorder have a normal lifespan, but they do have to have treatments for that. So let's go back to the PowerPoint slide. What do you think a patient with an autoimmune disorder, whatever it is, needs as treatment to help them, because you can't cure the disease. We don't have that yet. But what can you take or give them for slowing down the progression of a disorder like that? It's the immune system has gone haywire. So what would be a good treatment? All right. Have you heard of immunosuppressants? That's what they get, is immunosuppressants. So it slows down the autoimmune attack on their cells, but it comes with a caveat that you're suppressing your immune system, so these people are very vulnerable to viruses like colds and flus, and all kinds of things can make them very sick. But they weigh the pros and cons of the disorder and the treatment for it versus progressive damage. Okay, so let's move on. Here we go. Here is the blow-up view of the synaptic knob of a presynaptic neuron, which means it's a neuron before the synapse. A synapse is the space between a neuron and the postsynaptic cell, the cell it's trying to communicate with. It could be another neuron, it could be a muscle cell, or it could be a gland. And so I'm going to walk you through this GIF. What happens first is the secretory vesicles found in the synaptic knob release a neurotransmitter. In this case, it's little pink balls. All right. What they are going to do is they are going to bind to a receptor on the postsynaptic cell. Okay. So the neurotransmitter in pink is released, crosses the synapse, and binds with, there's the synapse, binds with the receptor in light blue here on the postsynaptic cell. Now, when it binds with that receptor, it's going to open up an ion channel, okay? So in this GIF, we'll watch it again, the pink ball gets on the receptor, opens up an ion channel, and the blue balls, which could be sodium, enter the cell and cause an action potential in that cell or stimulate it, okay? Okay. So presynaptic neuron is up here. It is the neuron that is secreting the neurotransmitter. The postsynaptic cell, if I can get it to go, is a neuron that it's being communicated with, or a cell, a muscle cell, or a gland. All right. So when you're looking at the Zoom lecture, this GIF will be active. When you're looking at the PDF version of it, unfortunately, it won't be. So this Zoom lecture on YouTube, you can look at these images over and over. And I also will have on the future slides, YouTube links to videos showing this. So let's move on. Okay, so Friday lecture, I know it is kind of short, but I really want to give you just a little introduction. What we talked about today, okay, let me zoom here, back, is neurons, whether they're sensory or motor neurons. If it's sensory, the information is ascending the spinal cord, going up into the brain to be interpreted. All right, remember in chapter 1, when we were talking about regulation of body temperature with negative feedback, do you remember what the sensors were in the body temperature regulation? I said the receptor, okay? You remember what it was? It's an afferent or sensory neuron. It was thermoreceptors, okay? So that's what I mean about sensory or afferent neurons, the receptors. What about the stretch receptors that you learned in the negative feedback control of blood pressure? What were those stretch receptors found in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries right here? What were those stretch receptors called? Baroreceptors, right? Okay, so these are what sensory or afferent neurons are doing. So in this case of blood pressure, your aorta has stretch receptors called baroreceptors, and your carotid arteries going up to your brain have stretch receptors. They pick up that information about is there high blood pressure or low blood pressure, and they will send an information to the integrating center, all right? So that information is going up. And we know that in the blood pressure regulation, it's going to the medulla, part of your brainstem. Well, then your medulla, let's say blood pressure was too high. A motor command, which is part of the efferent nervous system, would descend from the medulla, go down the spinal cord to your body, okay? That's going to be a motor command through motor neurons. And you know from chapter 1 that one of the muscle cells that are going to respond to that motor command is your heart. If your blood pressure was too high, your medulla would stimulate your heart muscle cells to slow down your blood pressure. The medulla is also sending a motor command through motor neurons down the efferent pathway to smooth muscle in your arteries. Now, if blood pressure is too high, what do your arteries need to do? Do they need to vasoconstrict to reduce blood pressure, or do they need to vasodilate to reduce blood pressure? If you said vasodilate, you're right, because when your arteries open up wide, your blood pressure drops. Remember the garden hose analogy. Okay, so I'm bringing together information that I started with in chapter 1, and now in chapter 4, we're going into more detail in these neurons, these receptors, these motor commands, okay? Okay, we talked about neuroglial cells. I gave you many that are in the central nervous system and a couple that are in the peripheral nervous system. We went over the anatomy of the neuron, and then specifically, I'm introducing you to how neurons communicate with cells, neurons, muscle cells, or glands by secreting neurotransmitters, okay? Here's the thing between a neuron and another cell. They don't directly communicate. They're not in touch with each other. There's a space called a synapse. And guess what? An action potential is an electrical impulse. Electrical impulses can't jump open space. They can't do that, all right? So what happens at the synapse is the action potential ends here at the synaptic knob. That action potential causes neurotransmitters to be released by vesicles. The neurotransmitter can cross the synapse, bind to receptors on that cell, and usually open an ion channel. And then the ion floods into the cell, and that tells the cell what to do. In the next chapter, we're going to be talking about what kind of ion channel is open will determine whether this cell gets stimulated or this cell gets relaxed. Okay, so it's a nice short lecture for Friday, so make sure and review this, and I will continue with Monday's lecture then. All right, so let's stop the share. And as always, if you ever have any questions or you want to have Zoom office hours, you need to email me so that we can set that up. All right, so see you guys on Monday.